Welcome to Security Dilemma, a podcast by the John Quincy Adams Society. I'm AJ Manuzzi, joined by my co-host John Allen Gay, as we have a conversation today with Dr. Albert Wolf. Dr. Wolf is a global fellow at Habib University. His research focuses on security studies with particular attention to the Middle East, the relationship between domestic political survival and international relations, as well as nuclear proliferation. He served as a foreign policy advisor to several U.S. presidential campaigns, as well as a foreign affairs staffer on Capitol Hill. In this episode, we discussed why America's Iran strategy is proving counterproductive and the politics of diplomacy within Iran. Join us as we have a conversation with Albert Wolf. Dr. Albert Wolf, welcome to Security Dilemma.
Thank you for having me.
So, I'm curious, we've all been following the news about the U.S.-Iran negotiations. What's the latest that you're hearing on the Iran file in the aftermath of the negotiations in Islamabad?
Okay, well, a couple of things. First of all, there's the Pakistani delegation led by the Pakistani military chief, General Asim. They're in Tehran, and they were greeted by the Iranian foreign minister personally, Abbas Araghchi. This was in the Iranian press. I just got a thing about this on Press TV as well as Al Arabiya, and so it shows how invested the Iranians are. Now, a couple of things. First of all, the Iranians have, they just put out that, a threat that they are willing to block the Red Sea. Obviously, they would have to do this through the Houthis. On the other hand, they're making noises that, they're willing to compromise. So in some ways, there does seem to be some overlap between what they're saying publicly and what the Trump administration is saying. Now, the Trump administration is also saying that, they're going to, maintain the blockade around the Strait of Hormuz. They're going to do it for as long as it takes, that sort of thing. But Trump has also said that he's optimistic that we can get a deal, and he said that he even said that we can do it in the next couple of days, even the next 2 days, which I think is unrealistic, but that's what he has said. So that's where we're at right now. And of course, the Egyptians are also involved in trying to bring a deal about.
You've said in some of your public writing that the administration and the Washington policy community are misreading the Iran crisis at almost every level. What do you mean by that?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, I don't believe that this war was necessary. You go back to the reports that came out right after the Islamabad talks fell apart. There was the Iranians said that they made an offer for a 5-year ban on enrichment. J.D. Vance said, well, we put out a 20-year ban on enrichment. This is stuff that probably could have been done diplomatically. We didn't really need, this massive air war to do it. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, Phil Gordon at Brookings, and who used to be the national security advisor to Kamala Harris, made a very good point at the beginning of March. There was this online talk at Brookings, and he said, the priorities have not been made clear. I mean, initially, you would think that this was all about nuclear. So you'd think we would be hitting the nuclear sites plus Iran's missile capabilities, which would make sense. We were talking about taking out their navy, doing, regime change, all that sort of thing. And, and nuclear was down to like a third or fourth place priority. So the other thing is, and you could see that, people like Dick Batts, Stephen Biddle have written about this, there is no strategy. There is no clear connection between, what our policy objectives are, and the military means being used to achieve them. Now, I have to say, and I think, and I would find it very surprising if other countries weren't taking note of this. Some of the military means that we're using are impressive, such as, the use of AI is unprecedented in this campaign. But, it's similar to what we did in Venezuela. You have this very, impressive use of, impressive tactical and even operational capabilities. But how is this advancing any of our strategic objectives? I'm not sure there. And I think that a lot of people are. And I think a lot of people, not just in the policy community, but a lot of people in the general public. And I think that that's a big reason why this war is so unpopular and why Trump's approval ratings are continuing to crater. And then, of course, you have the pushback. If you go, I think that a lot of people in the Trump administration felt that Iran was a paper tiger. They're clearly not, even though this has, had incredible damage to the Iranian economy. The regime is doing okay. I mean, if you look at the front page of the FT today, a lot of people on Wall Street, a lot of traders around the world have done handsomely by the volatility this has created. But this has hurt, average Americans. The price of gas is up, well over $4 a gallon. You're going to see an increase in the price of foodstuffs as this increases. So, and plus you've seen tremendous damage to various Gulf states, the Emiratis, the Saudis, Kuwait, Qatar, and so forth. And of course, even though Trump was warned about this by Nate Swanson well over a year ago, you have the blockade, you have the Iranian blockade of the Straits of Hormuz. So this has been very poorly handled from the beginning.
We always try to steelman opposing arguments on this show, and I guess like one of the arguments that I hear that I try to reckon with is the amount of destruction that's been inflicted on Iran, in particular on its military. And if you listen to the administration or some of the military leadership, they'll say, okay, we've hit 13,000 aim points. We've completely obliterated their navy. We've done huge damage to their missile force, to the supply chain for both of those things, to other big chunks of their military capacity. A lot of their leadership has been killed. That even if I guess to take that and say, okay, maybe if you're operating from an assumption that the regime is pretty much implacably opposed to the United States, to the regional order, etc., why isn't it better to have them be weaker than stronger? Why isn't it better to say, okay, their nuclear program is set back by some amount of time, their military programs are set back by some amount of time, their naval capability has been seriously degraded, et cetera, et cetera. What do you make of that?
There's a couple things to go with on there. First of all, I think this was in Barack Ravid's reporting that came out just earlier today in Axios, and in which he had a source in the administration saying that well, we know that their economy is hurt, they can't keep going at this rate. Now the question is, how much pain can a country suffer economically before they they give up? We're obviously we have a larger economy than Iran, but Iran's economy has been driven into the ground for a couple decades, both through the incompetence and the corruption of their own leadership, as well as the tremendous sanctions regime that they've been dealing with over the years. That's one thing. They have not. The thing that brought them about, if we go back to the JCPOA, were a combination of positive inducements, or carrots, if you prefer, as well as assurances. So that's one thing. It's not just going to be sticks. Now, the second thing is, all right, let's talk. If we were to talk about this, people like Kelly Greco she had a really smart piece in War on the Rocks a couple weeks ago about, you look at their weapons. I think that we very clearly underestimated their missile capabilities. Just because they're not firing as much stuff doesn't mean that their capabilities have necessarily been destroyed. They could be holding things in reserve, which would make sense. So right now we don't know exactly what they are. We can try. I mean, I've tried to think about this. What their exact capabilities are, and we've been trying to take out their precise mass in some ways, but we think about, well, maybe we've taken out about 50%. Well, for all the things we've destroyed, that doesn't seem all that great to me. Now we go to the argument, and Netanyahu has made this. Okay, it's better to have a weaker Iran than a stronger one. Okay, I mean, I can see the logic of that, but it does seem to feed into the idea that we're going, or at least, Israel will be going into this and just sort of mowing the grass, every few months or every couple of years. And that will take on a dynamic of its own. And we saw that in Gaza, which I think, led to October 7th, or certainly fed into it. I mean, obviously, Hamas hates Israel, wants to destroy Israel, but I think it fed into that dynamic. So we have those couple of things going on. The other thing is that, let's go back to the Iran-Iraq war. People said we killed this many Iranians, or the Iraqis killed this many Iranians. They're going to capitulate. It didn't happen. I mean, it took 8 years, before, Khomeini famously swallowed, the poison chalice. And also, if you look at, the leadership, now the leadership has been attrited. We've taken out, the supreme leader, Khamenei. We've taken out the head of the IRGC. It's been replaced. We've taken out the head of the Supreme National Security Council. We've taken out, all sorts of. We've taken out, the de facto leader, Larijani. We've taken out a ton of people there. Now they've been replaced. And one thing that has been reported on is there is a degree of fractiousness that wasn't there before, but there's also, some things haven't changed, which is, okay, Khamenei is dead, we get his son instead. The head of the IRGC is gone, but the IRGC is still there, and there's still a major veto player. They cleared the way for Khamenei's kid to become supreme leader. So a lot of the same types of people are in charge. So and I was thinking about this earlier. How much do these targeted assassinations accomplish strategically? Tactically, it's impressive, but on a strategic level, how much does it really change? Does it really change things? It may be disruptive for a minute, a day, a couple of days, but we're dealing with, Ghalibaf. But what's the real difference between him and a guy like Larijani? I think Larijani may have been a more effective operator, but I don't see much of a difference between them. The only thing is that I do think there may be something to some of the economic pain they're feeling and we're feeling, and that could, potentially push both sides toward an agreement.
Yeah, I think the question about decapitation strikes is something that's going to be on all of our minds, all over the political science literature in the next few years for sure. Since you did mention the role and the influence of the IRGC in this iteration of the Iranian regime, I'm really curious how you would assess their relative power and influence. I believe when Sina Tusi went on this podcast, he mentioned, I think it was the intelligence chief of the IRGC was reportedly really close with Khamenei, But really interested in getting your read on that.
I can't give you like an exact number on influence. I mean, that's really hard to measure. But the IRGC has been estimated to be at least the third most important actor in the Iranian economy. They have their fingers in just about every pie imaginable. So that's one thing. And for years, people have been talking about the so-called Pasdaran coup, where they would be putting in somebody. Now, the idea behind this Pasdaran coup is that they put in, a military guy. But I think we've seen it today. I mean, Khamenei, the Mojtaba Khamenei would not be in office if he didn't, without the support of the IRGC. So I think that the IRGC coup has come to fruition. So we are, there was some stuff on Twitter last night and today about, who's running Iran. And, yes, Mojtaba Khamenei is the supreme leader, but the IRGC, has a tremendous amount of influence. They don't just have a seat at the table; they've got several seats at the table, and it's going to be that way for the next few years, unless the regime falls apart, under, its own weight, or for whatever reason we decide to go for regime change, which I just don't think we have the stomach for right now.
What about on the nuclear file? As you mentioned, we can blow a lot of things up, but I'm interested in your read of the impact of the US and Israeli strikes on the actual resolve of Iran to potentially pursue nuclear weapons. And also, if seeing the impact that they've been able to have on US public opinion, on the US conduct of the war through their shutting the Strait of Hormuz, if that is a complementary tool to the nuclear file or something that ultimately they might just opt for, this is kind of a good enough tool of deterrence without going over that nuclear threshold.
Well, the second part, I think you make a great point, is how much do we need this when we can seize this choke point? How much do we need this when, they have invested tons over the years in their missile force. How much, do we really need this in order to deter anybody else? And I think they've demonstrated this with their strikes on America's Gulf allies. Even though the initial thinking was, this is kind of stupid, they should be trying to drive a wedge, they've demonstrated, that and their drone forces, which are pretty cheap in the scheme of things to put together. With the nuclear stuff, I mean, there's a lot of thinking that, Saddam gave up the bomb, he was invaded and overthrown. Gaddafi gave up the bomb, invaded and overthrown. Ukraine gave up the bomb, invaded and overthrown. North Korea didn't give up the bomb, nobody's invaded them. But at the same time, nuclear weapons programs are really expensive. And one other thing is that Iran has almost had this, sort of satyagraha-like ethos, where, yeah, they've had dealings with the AQ Khan network, but they've really wanted to do a lot of it themselves. This has been a really self-reliant program. So that's why it's taken them so long. So they do have a latent capacity. Now, it's going to take a minute before we can really determine how much has been destroyed. We know there's over 600 kilograms out there, and that we're going to have to get in some serious, digging equipment to get to it. And also, we're going to have to, if we're serious about eliminating their capacity, we're going to have to take out some mines that they have, uranium mines too. I can't imagine, that the Iranian public has soured on the nuclear program. At one point I saw some polls a few years ago that showed sort of a rural-urban split, where you had more people in rural areas in favor of a nuclear program as opposed to urban areas. I can't imagine, there being real opposition to a nuclear program now. And of course, people have always been in favor of the right to enrich, uh, just as a matter of status and national pride. But to go back to your last point, I think that being able to seize the Strait of Hormuz, being able and having their missile program are smart ways to be able to deter adversaries in the region, especially given Iran is not very keen on investing in their conventional forces at this time.
So, what do you make of Iran's choice to have the meeting in Islamabad to negotiate with Vance, to send such a high level delegation, led by Mohammad Bakr Ghalibaf, who's, a big time insider, deep IRGC ties. There were at least one or two other people on the delegation with kind of similar profiles. This was much more of a Iranian deep state type delegation, and high level delegation than past iterations of negotiations where they've tended to be lower level and also more concentrated toward the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which is not a central player in Iranian foreign policy. Like, what's your take on why that happened?
First of all, they sent about 70 people in that delegation. A lot of them were wearing black, still in mourning for Ali Khamenei. And you're right, this was not a bunch of bureaucrats or technocrats. These were real players. These were serious people. I mean, not that technocrats aren't serious, but I mean, these were a bunch of high level guys. I think that they went to at least show that they were serious about trying to work something out. I do think though that the US went in with this idea that we're, sort of like thinking behind maximum pressure. We're going to put everything on the table and we're going to resolve everything, which is ridiculous. I think the US, tried to get too much, but I think that the idea of a 5 year ban on or ceasing to enrich for 5 years is a serious offer. I mean, we can't live with that, but I think it's a decent starting point.
And you're speaking to us from Pakistan, and I'm curious how this war has been playing in Pakistan, how it's been impacting Pakistan, and why Pakistan, in partnership with China, has been the mediator here. They both sought to be the mediator, and then they were chosen as the mediator.
Well, a couple of reasons. Like, for one thing, I mean, I'll answer the second part first. Pakistan does not want this war at all. And it's, first of all, Pakistan has actually had very good ties with both Iran and with Saudi Arabia. To give you an idea, I think it was just today or yesterday, Saudi Arabia helped them pay off this, I think it was a $3.5 billion debt to the Emiratis, and put in a several $1 billion on Pakistan's behalf to the IMF. I mean, Pakistan has been bailed out more than any other country by the IMF. It's been more than 20 times. So, and Pakistan has a security pact with the Saudis, putting them under their nuclear umbrella. That said, they don't want to honor the agreement because they do have good ties with the Iranians. And, they've been getting into it with the Taliban in Afghanistan recently. And the Taliban, kind of sort of said, we will assist Iran. Now, of course, that's vague, but that's sort of the last thing that Pakistan wants. Now, when we and the Israelis took out Khamenei, people in Pakistan were furious. I mean, there was an assault on the U.S. consulate in Karachi. The Pakistani public opinion was livid. This was not limited to the Shia population, which is between 10 and 15% of the population in Pakistan. People saw this as the Zionist Crusader alliance, engaged in aggression. So they really do not need this. This has also really hurt the Pakistani economy. The Pakistani economy, since they got the bailout in 2024, had been doing better. But the thing is that there aren't fuel subsidies in Pakistan. So we don't have Uber, but we have rideshare programs like Kareem and Yango. Well, for those drivers, if they make $20 a day, that's considered really good. But they're paying as much for gasoline as any American does. So those people, the average Pakistani is paying as much as an American does, and it's hurting Americans a lot. So if $20 a day is a good day for you, you're really getting hurt. To give you an idea, just the cost of this is hurting people, across the board. So they don't want this. So Pakistan, wanted to be in this on their own. Wanted to be in this on their own accord. The U.S. wanted Pakistan to do this. Trump and General Asim have a good rapport. I think that the Saudis wanted them in on this. And then, of course, the Chinese did too. Remember a couple weeks ago, Pakistan and China, there was a meeting between the Pakistani foreign minister and Chinese foreign minister Wang Yi, and they put out this 5-point plan, which went nowhere. But it was very obvious that the Chinese, wanted Pakistan at the table. So Pakistan was sort of became the mediator of choice for everybody.
Yeah, and on that, I know there's other regional partners as well, regional countries rather, like Turkey, that are also trying to be a part of this mediation, bring this conflict to some sort of resolution. Do you think that Pakistan or Turkey or any of these other potential players have the leverage, have the chops to bring some sort of lasting termination to this conflict?
The short answer is no, I don't, because the thing is that whether it's Pakistan or Turkey or Egypt, everybody has skin in the game. They don't want this war. Everybody was opposed to this, but they don't have the ability to enforce a settlement. And I think that any settlement is going to just sort of probably paper over differences. They may be able to sort of rein in Iran. How do they rein in the United States? The United States would be the party that could enforce it, but the United States is a combatant. So how do you do that? So that's the problem. They can provide their good offices, to bring everybody together, but they don't have the ability to, impose some sort of serious punishment upon somebody for violating the terms of an agreement. So that's the fundamental problem.
So you have an article in Review on Israeli strategy after the 12-day war, and another on war termination and Israel's so-called Seven Front War, which is basically the post-October 7th war. Are there any key takeaways there that you'd like to share with us?
Well, my thing on war termination, and I know I'll have to make changes to it, not just because of reviewers, but because of the nature of this, is that you do have this element of strategy being an illusion. To go back to the piece that Dick Betts wrote several years ago, and also, we talk about war, especially in a rationalist framework, as being driven by uncertainty. Well, one thing we've seen in wars, Mara Karlin once gave this press conference. She was talking about Ukraine, but we're seeing it with this conflict too. seeing these technological changes. Well, usually, okay, war is driven by uncertainty. There's disagreements over the balance of power. And then war breaks out, it resolves, the incomplete information problem is resolved. States can come to a settlement. But here's the thing is that you see innovations and increasing numbers of innovations taking place, during this war. So it makes it harder to reach a settlement. And so that's one thing that makes this war different from other wars, and it poses a challenge to theories of war termination.
Hey folks, exciting news. The John Quincy Adams Society is pleased to announce its 2026 summer conference for early career professionals and college students. Participants spend 4 days engaging with thinkers, practitioners, and scholars. It's an opportunity to step back and examine some of the big, fundamental questions about American foreign policy at a time when those questions are more pressing than ever. With major transformations underway in the U.S. national security space, policy shapers in all parts of the political spectrum need to feel comfortable talking not only about tactics and tools, but also about goals and ends. The 2026 conference will proceed in 2 major parts. First, our participants will talk grand strategy, a state's theory of how to cause security for itself. This Morgenthau Grand Strategy Seminar centers on small seminar-style discussions with rising international affairs scholars, conducted in partnership with the University of Notre Dame's O'Brien Notre Dame International Security Center. The program bears the name of acclaimed realist IR scholar Hans J. Morgenthau. Participants come away with a richer understanding of what grand strategy is, theories that can animate grand strategies, and applications in key regions and issue sets. This comprises the first evening of the conference, the second full day, and most of the third day of the summer conference. Second, participants will dive into policy and practice. They'll take part in a crisis simulation that puts them in the shoes of key decision makers. They'll hear from bipartisan panels of experts on pressing topics in U.S. national security, including dissections of the latest conflicts and their meaning for U.S. strategy and security. They'll connect with professionals who can share secrets of success, and they'll do all this in a cohort of their future peers, current and aspiring U.S. foreign policy professionals. This comprises the third evening and the closing fourth day of the conference. If you're interested in applying for the 2026 summer conference, don't miss out. Go to jqas.org/2026-summer conference. We'll post the link in the show notes, and we look forward to looking over your application. Thank you, and now back to the show.
What would you say? I mean, so it sounds like your answer might be that there's not a strategy, but what would you say is Israel's strategy or goal right now in its approach to the region? Because there's a general sense that October 7th is kind of a sea change moment for them, that there's been a serious reduction in their willingness to tolerate any kind of threat in their neighborhood, a serious increase in their willingness to act against those threats. And then there's been a lot of other speculation outside of Israel about like what exactly is there a goal? Is there an end state? You see people joking about Turkey being next after Iran. I mean, there's just all these different layers coming through. What's your read?
Well, first of all, I think that I just saw this thing by John Reed at the FT earlier this morning about a so-called Netanyahu doctrine. And a point that I make in the piece is that Netanyahu's so-called doctrine is really, I think Graham Allison had a term for it. He called it, this is years ago, called it the trash can model or the garbage can model, where you sort of, take a little bit from one thing and a little bit from another and you put them together. And that's what Netanyahu's done. In Israel, there's much, especially when you talk about, the people that work on strategy, there's more disagreement than, we're really paying attention to. You have some people like Gideon Sa'ar that are much more in favor of a traditional doctrine of containment and deterrence. Obviously, he's very hawkish, but doing that sort of thing. Netanyahu seems to be fine with basically having a couple of failed states near Israel because you will, because this goes back to an earlier question you had, because they'll be weakened, and so they're not able to project force against Israel. Now Iran is not this is not like, you know Egypt under Nasser. You don't have a state that's able to put troops on the ground and invade Israel, but it is a country that is able to fire lots of missiles and could conceivably develop a nuclear weapon and destroy Israel. A weakened Iran is fine, even if it's a failed state, or let's say this is a country that kind of looks like Iran under the late Qajars. Same with Syria, for that matter. And you've heard a lot of talk about this with Syria. Why aren't they pursuing a peace deal with Syria? Well, it seems as though they'd be more happy with a weakened, divided Syria than with one that's united and whole, but they have a deal over the Golan Heights. So that's where I think they're at now. Obviously, post October 7th, Israel is much more risk acceptant. The Seven Front War is Israel's longest war. They've been actively fighting since October 8th, 2023. And so they're much more willing to take risks, to take the fight to the enemy and that sort of thing.
You've also written on American grand strategy in the Middle East. Where do you see things right now for the United States?
Well, quite honestly, I don't see us as having a grand strategy at all. If you just go back to the couple documents that were produced earlier this year, there was a lot of people were praising the first one that Trump put out, and then the one that was put out by the Defense Department. They were really out of sync with one another. And so I'm not sure what our priorities are. A lot of people have said Trump has become a neocon and that sort of thing. I honestly don't know what our grand strategy is. You could go back to, that article that's now 30 years old by Barry Posen. It has these sort of 4 ideal, typical grand strategies. Trump's stuff doesn't fit into any of them. It seems very ad hoc to me.
Yeah, looking back at the NSS, there were some who said, "Oh, Trump kind of sees the region and especially the Gulf as kind of just a pot where he can where we can invest and we can make money and we can help them advance their AI technology, rather than either sort of what some folks in the establishment were seeing as a place of competition with China, or further back, a sort of forum to wage the global war on terror." How do you see the Gulf states kind of responding to this conflict? And, ultimately, you've said that there kind of isn't a strategy, but how do you think the Trump administration sees them fit into their, if not a strategy, their plans?
I don't know how they see them fitting into their plans, because I don't know what their plans are. I don't think that they know what their plans are. I think that they were very pleased when they cut all these deals over AI with the Emiratis. I think that they were very pleased when they were able to get Saudi Arabia to agree to invest between $600 billion and $1 trillion in the United States. However, you notice that when it came to the nuclear issue, Saudi Arabia would not sign a 123 agreement. They wouldn't give up the right to enrich. Similar things similar problems that we have with Iran. Although a lot of people have said that, they see this as the moment where the Gulf states will finally sort of coalesce and work together on defense. A lot of people said that after 1991, after the first Gulf War. Didn't happen. The Oman, brought the proposal to Kuwait, and they didn't go for it. I think that what's more likely is they will work with these sort of extra regional partners. I mean, I think what would be more likely is for the Qataris, for example, to tighten their relationship with the Turks. There's already, I mean, even before this thing broke out, Turkey wanted in on the relationship between Pakistan and Saudi Arabia to get under Pakistan's nuclear umbrella. So, I mean, just as an example, you could see how some of them would maybe. I mean, India has had a very, very limp wristed response to all of this. Previously I would have said, maybe India would get involved. But I mean, China would be a very obvious partner to want to work with. So I don't see the Gulf states working together at all. I could see maybe, a couple of the, again, like Saudi Arabia and Bahrain working together. But I don't see them work. I don't see the Saudis and the Emiratis teaming up, given, what they just went through in Yemen. So I think that there would be sort of intra-Gulf blocks forming and working with, states outside of the Gulf. And I mean, other people have predicted, well, they'll move closer to Israel. I don't see that really happening. Maybe the Emiratis will continue doing that, but I don't see them doing that, in some sort of expansion or intensification of the Abraham Accords. I don't think that's on the table.
Yeah, two follow-ups there. One on the Gulf Israel thing. I've heard some chatter that like for the Israelis are looking at the way the chessboard is stacked and saying, look, yeah, the Gulfies are not happy about the war or about Gaza or any of these other things, but they've just seen they need to majorly update their air defenses. And guess who has air defenses? Israel. And that's going to be an area where there will have to be cooperation regardless. And then second, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia pact. There's been a lot of buzz about that before the war. There's been buzz during the war that, like this means Pakistan's going to come in and help Saudi Arabia. I feel like we're kind of seeing some of the limits of that pact, but I'd love to hear your take on what's going on with that. Because to me, if the Gulfies plan is find security partners outside the region, this seems like a good starting point for assessing the possibilities. And if it's not working, that would be a warning for them.
Well, okay, first of all, even before this war, look at what the Gulf states are doing in terms of their universities. They are really investing in STEM. I mean, all their universities are basically becoming STEM factories. And so I think that you're going to see a lot of indigenous programs and that they may just continue ramping up. So that's one thing. The Emiratis, who not that long ago had a terrible relationship with Turkey, things have warmed up with them, especially when it comes to drones, because the Turks have shown themselves to be pretty good at that. So that's another thing I think can and likely will happen. The third thing is, I mean, I remember this book that Yoel Guzansky wrote, came out before the Abraham Accords, talking about how the Israelis used the sales of their military sales as a form of soft power. I think that they can do that, and their cyber stuff, but I think that states like Saudi Arabia still will refuse to recognize, just because of all the unpopularity of everything that's happened in Gaza after October 7th. And then with the thing with Pakistan buys military technology. They don't sell it. They just don't have the intellectual capital. I'm not saying that people in Pakistan are stupid, but what I am saying is that they don't have a real domestic industry for it. So what they have is they have a nuclear program, and they are highly resistant to wanting to honor this pact they have with Saudi Arabia. So I don't think that this is this is a real option for anybody right now.
There's another interesting piece that you wrote a while back, late Biden era, I believe, but that I think the topic is on a lot of people's mind. And it's the topic of entrapment and how the United States in particular can avoid entrapment within its alliances and particularly its partners, taking actions that might not be aligned with the interests of the United States and potentially dragging them into conflict. So just really curious if you could walk some of our listeners through some of the options that are available to American policymakers to limit the entrapment mechanisms inherent in a number of U.S. alliances or partnerships.
There have been a lot of people saying that Netanyahu is running the country and that kind of thing, and I think that that's nonsense. I mean, Trump, was able to humiliate him, and after the botched attack in Qatar, he forced him to get on the phone and apologize to the Qatari prime minister. He, when Netanyahu was getting out of line in Syria, he forced him to knock it off. However, there are a few things that the U.S. can do to avoid being entrapped or dragged into a war over that it only shares partial interests with one of its allies. The first is that it can just reinterpret the terms of the alliance. Lots of alliances are written with all sorts of, they're written in ways that they just have outs. Even Article 5 in NATO, it has vague elements to it that say, you don't have to, do everything. I mean, there are lots of countries that helped us in Afghanistan, but they sent supplies. They didn't send troops. And I mean, as David Auerswald wrote this great book about Afghanistan, countries that helped us in Afghanistan, but they didn't, they had, they used all sorts of rules to limit, what they could and didn't have to do. The second thing is that the United States can apply all sorts of pressure. So if you take the case of Israel, for example, the United States can say, all right, well, we're not going to support you diplomatically. We're not going to support you in public forums like the UN. We're not going to support you economically. And you could think of a range of economic tools the U.S. could use, starting with limiting our willingness to refinance certain loans to even going so far as to cutting off aid. We could go back to what Gerald Ford threatened to do in 1975 over Sinai, over the Sinai 2 talks, and threatened to re-examine the relationship. And then, of course, there's the military dimension, which is, just focusing upon Israel, we can, cut them off militarily. And the Israeli military industry is deeply entangled in the American defense establishment. So those are a handful of things the United States can do. We don't have to be, and seldom, and we seldom are dragged into wars over which we only partially share an ally's interests in. So, and one other thing, Victor Cha wrote about this in the Asian context. The alliances we draw up, allow us to sort of jerk the chain on an ally. So there's many things that we can do to prevent this from happening.
I've done a lot of work on audience costs and peacemaking, including in non-democracies. And I'm curious, for our audience of current, future, and aspiring policymakers, what would you have them know about that?
Well, simply put, audience costs are the domestic political sanctions a leader suffers for making a public threat and failing to live up to it, failing to carry it out. And these are, domestic punishments up to and including removal from office. So, I wrote this one paper a few years ago about Ehud Olmert in Israel back in 2006, in Lebanon, with the 34 Days War, the Second Lebanon War. He made a series of very explicit public threats saying that he would continue to use force until Hezbollah was destroyed and the kidnapped Israeli soldiers were returned. He didn't fulfill those threats. Now, his poll numbers collapsed, but he was able to stay in office by expanding his coalition. And so, now, I mean, there's been a debate about whether audience costs exist and how much they matter. Some people have theorized that a leader's ability to generate audience costs gives them an advantage, because if other parties can see that they are able to mortgage their political survival, it's a costly signal, and it shows that they are resolved, that they're willing to put their political survival on the line. It means they're willing to sort of go all the way. They're willing to carry out their threats to use force. Other people have said, that they don't exist. Todd Sexer and Alex Downs wrote a piece saying they don't exist, and others have said, well, they do, but they're very small. People like Nicholas Sambanis, Jack Snyder, and Erica Lonergan written pieces saying, they're very small. So there is a debate over this. But the basic idea is that leaders who could be held to account, and it was long held it was democracies. Some have said there are certain types of autocracies can generate these costs.
Yeah, I've certainly heard this raised in the context of Iran. That the kind of core Iranian, I guess you could say, selectorate or political base of the regime, that there are certain things that it wouldn't put up with if there were major changes on the nuclear file, on the ideological orientation of the regime, etc. What do you make of that, just on this kind of autocratic or non-democratic side?
Well, first of all, on Iran, I think that maybe that's true. The only thing is that with Iran, it's much harder to see, and so with the audience cost thing, it has to be transparent. So with Iran, it's much harder to see. With some states, I mean, it's like let's take North Korea, for example. We really don't know what's going on there. Even if you have, let's say it's run sort of like an elite club, we really don't know. Other countries, like, let's say, the Soviet Union under Khrushchev. I mean, okay, there was Kremlinology, but we sort of had this idea that, he was constrained by other elites. Or China, after Mao, before Xi was sort of this way. So, there's a lot of autocracies that are run this way. So I agree with that. But with the Iran point, I do think that there's a lot of groups, like with the IRGC, for example, that have been resistant to compromises over the bomb, because it's a rich source of rents, and also there's the issue of national pride and status.
Finally, looking at your CV, you've taught or studied matters of international security at universities in the United States, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Azerbaijan, Israel, Kurdistan. I might even be leaving some out. What's your takeaway from that diverse experience, again, for our audience of current and future policymakers?
Well, I mean, I've learned a lot. I mean, it's been very humbling. I mean, each country has a very different perspective, and it's like, when you study international relations, especially in the U.S., you realize how Americentric this field of study truly is. So that was one thing. I've learned many different things just by living in these different countries, and just listening to my colleagues, listening to, I mean, the Uber driver. One thing that I picked up that I've been really shocked by in Pakistan is just how much contempt there is for the military. And I was really surprised by how vocal people were. And that stunned me, because in Azerbaijan, nobody said anything bad about the Aliyevs and the Pashayevs. I don't believe that there was, the people didn't have issues with them. But I never heard anybody say anything bad about them. Same in Kurdistan. I never heard anybody say anything bad about the Barzanis. But in Pakistan, people really don't like the military. And I mean, this is a polite audience, so I won't repeat the words that were used, but I mean, people know their English curse words, and they shared them with me. And I mean, that took me aback. So those are just a couple of, things that I picked up along the way, living in these different places.
All right. Well, Dr. Albert Wolf, thank you so much for coming on Security Dilemma.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been great.
Security Dilemma is a podcast by the John Quincy Adams Society. To learn more about our programs, visit our website at jqas.org. Remember to rate and review on your podcast app and join us every Tuesday for new episodes of Security Dilemma.